Good morning, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us for Connecticut's first Sustainability and Resilience Week, or as the panel just decided, we'll call it the inaugural Sustainability and Resilience Week. I'm Lee Welpton, Director of Environmental Infrastructure Programs here at the Connecticut Green Bank, and your host for today's session. I'm joined and supported by Rudy Stark, my colleague at the Connecticut Green Bank, and I'm thrilled in a moment to introduce a stellar lineup of panelists. Today's session is Roadmap to Resilience, Driving Resilience Improvement and Investment in Fairhaven and Beyond. Our panel is going to delve into municipal resilience issues and new data, tools, and financing programs to help cities and towns make the critical investments they need for preparedness. I want to just take a moment for a couple quick housekeeping items. So today's session is being recorded. We will send out a link as a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this session. So that will have the recording and also other resources that are mentioned on today's session. We will also have time at the end for open Q&A. If you have any questions during the session, please enter them in the questions section on the GoToWebinar panel, and we will do our best to answer them at the end. Rudy will be helping to feed some of those questions to us on the panel. So with that, we'll jump right in. We've got a jam-packed session, and I am really pleased to make a special introduction to help ground our session. Next slide, Rudy. So, Mayor Elicker, really pleased to welcome you today as we kick off the session. Mayor Elicker is New Haven's 51st mayor. He was reelected to his third term in 2023 to continue his work toward a more resilient and equitable city. A former teacher and environmental advocate, Mayor Elicker brings hands-on experience in issues of municipal resilience to his role. In fact, as it happens, Justin was my TA when I first moved to New Haven, and like many an impressionable grad student, helped to orient our whole cohort to the city's urban ecology and to issues of social well-being, whether that had to do with stormwater management or urban tree canopy. So it is truly my pleasure to hand things over to Mayor Elicker to kick things off for us today. Justin, over to you.
Thanks, Lee. It's great to be here, and I wish I could stay for the whole panel presentation, but we've got a pretty incredible panel here with representatives from the Green Bank, CIRCA. We've got the only Steve Winter, our Director of Climate and Sustainability in the city. And I think we're going to have a second Lee that's going to join soon. So what an honor to have two Lees on one panel. That's pretty spectacular there. We're doing a ton in New Haven on resiliency. And on the big picture, we're investing over $200 million in our coastal resiliency and shoreline neighborhoods. And you're going to see a lot of that work happening in the next 3 to 5 years. We've put in with our partners over 200 bioswales to help the city manage stormwater, planting 5,000 trees over the next 5 years. The first of which, the first neighborhood we focused on was Fairhaven. The city partnered with CIRCA and a citizen and technical advisory committee to develop a resilient Fairhaven plan. And there's a lot of focus on climate and adaptation. And on top of all that, we really believe in Fairhaven, and we're investing in Fairhaven in so many other ways with the Grand Avenue initiative that's thanks to state and the city funding, $7.5 million investment in that corridor. It's a 1.5 mile stretch of Grand Avenue that's going to dramatically change with new roadway improvements and traffic calming, more infrastructure for pedestrian and cyclists, which obviously helps on the climate side as well. We're investing a lot more in affordable housing. We've got the Strong School project that's in the making, bus rapid transit along Grand Avenue that's going to facilitate a lot of more people being able to access fast public transit to get where they need to go. We've actually received, thanks to the state, $5 million to improve the Mill River corridor as well. And so there's so much work going on. And this is an opportunity with the panel, I think, to talk with each other and think about long-term resiliency. Fairhaven is a pretty vulnerable part of our state. New Haven is, but Fairhaven in particular, because it is effectively surrounded by water and has a lot of challenges around resiliency. You see in urban centers an increased level of heat typically as well. So there's a lot of challenges, and I'm looking forward to hearing what the panel is going to say about these challenging issues. Really grateful that you chose the focus of Fairhaven, and thanks again for letting me say some opening remarks. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks, Mayor. And I believe you might stick around with us for a few minutes, but understand you're also up against a busy day. So thanks for joining us at the top of the session. And we will go to the next slide and get things started with our panel. So I'd like to go ahead and hand things over for a quick round of lightning introductions to the panel before we jump right in with John Trzynski's presentation. So I hope Lee has been able to join us. We'll see. Rudy, it looks like he's in, perhaps not yet as a panelist. So maybe we'll go Randy, John, Stephen, and then hope to have Lee join us. So Randy, can you kick things off?
Hi, Lee. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. My name is Randy Collins. I'm the Associate Director of Public Policy for the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities. We'll be talking very briefly today about the recent flood study that CCM has put together, worked very hard on, and looking forward to the conversation as we go forward.
Awesome. I see that Lee has joined. We'll give him a second to acclimate. John, can I punt to you next?
Yeah, no problem, Lee. Good morning, everyone. My name is John Trzynski. I'm the Director of Resilience Planning at CIRCA, or the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. Also the Project Director for the Resilient Connecticut program, which has partnered with the city on the Resilient Fairhaven work that we'll be discussing today.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Stephen. You are on mute, sir.
Sorry, I had sneezed earlier. I'm Steve Winder. I'm the Executive Director for Climate and Sustainability at the city, and was part of the planning team with other folks from the city, our Assistant City Engineer, Don Henning, and folks from CIRCA and the community as part of the Resilient Fairhaven planning process.
Excellent. And Lee, I see you are off mute at the moment, so I hope you can hear us.
I am. I'm not quite figuring out how to get the camera to work, but Lee Cruz, Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven.
Excellent. Thank you. And we can help you get that going, especially as we're going to hand things over to John, and we can move. Next slide, Rudy. Excellent. So John's going to ground us in the work of CIRCA on Roadmap to Resilience for Connecticut. New report with a really stellar set of recommendations. So without stealing any of your thunder, John, I will pass it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Lee. So I'm going to get us started and discuss some of the work that we've been doing at CIRCA with this Resilient Connecticut program in Fairhaven, and sort of our recommendations for how we can move forward as a state. And then we'll have a great discussion. Next slide. So CIRCA, a little bit about our mission. We are a research center of excellence at the University of Connecticut. We're in the marine science program at the Avery Point campus, but we work with our colleagues across the Yukon in the various departments and schools. It's an interdisciplinary program that is aimed at assisting communities with adapting to climate change impacts. Next slide. So this Resilient Connecticut program, it began in 2018 in Fairfield and New Haven counties and has since expanded to other parts of the state. And the goal of the program really is to help the state develop a pipeline of resilience projects and, sort of helping to facilitate a process between state agencies and local communities, community-based organizations. We procure, design and engineering teams to work with communities, and it's been a very successful program in helping to move forward some of the unmet planning needs across the state. Next slide. So to date, we worked with several regional councils of governments, and then these icons here are some of the site and the neighborhood scale planning studies that we've done as part of this program so far. Next slide. But today we're going to talk about Fairhaven, which is one of the, let's go back one, which is one of the communities that we have worked with through this Resilient Connecticut program. So as the mayor said, Fairhaven is a peninsula. It's home to about 19,000 people, surrounded by water on three sides. You have the Quinnipiac River to the east, the Mill River to the west, the confluence of those two rivers at the Long Island Sound. So the peninsula is subject to several different types of flood risk. And so early on in our vulnerability assessment process in Fairfield and New Haven counties, Fairhaven emerged as a place, a potential priority for our program. But also I think, Fairhaven is a unique community in Connecticut in a lot of ways, but is also a place where you will find many of the challenges and opportunities that are common across the state of Connecticut in these questions about how to respond to climate change. And for that reason, it's a good place to ground the discussion of kind of where we go from here as a state. So there, as I mentioned, there's the riverine flood risk. There's also a coastal flood risk associated with the Long Island Sound and storm surges. There's also stormwater flood risk. So in some cases, there's combinations of, backflow through outfalls that prevents the conveyance of stormwater in some cases, in some of the underpasses and roadways that has caused different types of chronic flooding in the neighborhood. There's also the heat risk. There's a lot of dense housing, and relative to some other parts of the city or even the region, not a lot of tree canopy. And so for that reason, there's a vulnerability to heat. The area just to the west of the Mill River, there's a lot of impervious surfaces, parking lots, rooftops that emit heat into the local environment, and the prevailing winds from the west to the east, bring that air and that heat to the neighborhood. There's also the legacy of industrial land use, particularly in the Mill River area. For example, there's Ball Island, where English Station, coal-fired power plant, operated for many, many decades, which is still the subject of discussion about sort of how to clean up that site and what is the future vision for some of these industrial land uses that is accounting for the climate risk over time. There's also current industrial activity. So, the salt piles that deliver salt across the state, and all the trucks that deliver that salt across the state, is a current source of pollution for the neighborhood. There's also issues of transportation. So you can see the I-91 corridor, which effectively can turn the neighborhood into an island. So there's questions around, what is I think the infrastructure, the current infrastructure is really suited to car travel and trucks and those sorts of activities, and sort of what is the future vision for people who are walking in the neighborhood, getting to where they need to go, making that safer, more accommodating, people who want to use bikes, public transportation, things like that. So I think it's the overlap of all of those different things, the flood risk, the heat risk, these questions around economic revitalization and how to move forward with a new vision for those legacy industrial sites and brownfields, and thinking about transportation and all of these things that make this, a place that is challenging, but also where there's a lot of opportunities. All right, next slide. So, obviously CIRCA, we came to this, I think, from a perspective of flood risk, and that's been documented in many cases. During the course of our study, we had a couple of coastal flood events, and we were able to document the current state of flood risks in the neighborhood, which, many people in the neighborhood have been living with this, and it's been a challenge for the city and the community. Next slide. And so part of what we were doing was trying to understand the future projection of flood risk for Fairhaven. And so CIRCA anticipates that sea level is likely to rise up to 20 inches by 2050. And that is our recommendation for communities across the state, is to plan for that. And so what we were doing is modeling the picture of future flood risk for the neighborhood. And what we see from that is that the frequency of flooding is likely to change in Fairhaven, like many other communities along the coast, by a factor of 5 to 10. So what does that mean? It means that the places that flood in our historical understanding of, say, the 100-year flood or the 1% annual chance flood, are likely to flood more on the frequency of every 10 years or so. The places that flood currently every 10 years are likely to flood on an annual basis. So these places in red and purple here, in particular, the Mill River District and some of those industrial land uses, are likely to become more and more chronically flooded in the future. And so whatever happens here is going to have to sort of adapt to that changing flood risk. Next slide. So community engagement, coming at this from the lens of an academic institution, professionals, technical expertise coming to the community, I think the lesson learned here has been, you have to show up, you have to establish relationships, you have to build trust, and that conversation has to be an ongoing conversation between the various departments and institutions like CIRCA and the Green Bank and others. And that process requires resources. Resources for the community to participate, resources for the people who are doing that engagement. And that is one of our recommendations coming out of this work, is the critical importance of financial resources to have a continual conversation about moving some of these ideas forward. Also, the role of community-based organizations is critical. So organizations in the neighborhood that are already providing community services, like Junta for Progressive Action, for instance, was one of the organizations that we engaged as part of this. So the role of community-based organizations in all of this is critical. Next slide. Another thing that we came to as part of this work was this, let's go back one, is this idea of resilience hubs. So in our conversations with the emergency management staff within the city, we came to understand that there's, there are plans to evacuate folks from Fairhaven to other parts of the city. So we started to think about this idea of, are there libraries, schools, churches, senior centers that could be augmented to provide support to the community in times of crisis or times of natural disasters. So we started to think about strategically, where do we see some of these facilities that could be hubs or resilience hubs for the community going forward. So again, this is another one of our recommendations, is that this idea of community-based resilience hubs is also a critical strategy for Fairhaven and for the rest of the city and the state. Next slide. So we did develop a concept plan for a couple of areas within the neighborhood, and the idea here was to develop some strategies that could be relevant to this area, but also could be applied to other parts of the neighborhood and other parts of the city. So in this case, we were looking at the John Murphy Drive area. And I think the idea here was to try to balance the flood risk reduction and the protection strategy there with some of these other concepts, like how are people walking, what are the transportation options, are there ways to soften the shoreline and move some of the protective infrastructure back from the shoreline, open up more public access to the waterfront. And sort of like bringing all these things together was the goal with this particular concept. Next slide. So this is a concept plan that was developed by our colleagues at Fuss and O'Neill, who worked on this project with CIRCA in the city. And it features a couple of different things. It features elevating John Murphy Drive and using that as a flood protection piece of infrastructure. And then what that has the potential to do is allow the city to make confident decisions about resilient redevelopment, to the west of, or to the east, sorry, of the flood protection feature. But the shoreline itself could be thought of as over time transitioning to a place that is floodable, that then becomes a community asset in terms of public access to the shoreline, community gathering spaces, but also improving the ecosystem functions, the natural functions of the shoreline over time as well. So reducing some of the parking lot areas, consolidating some of the parking. We also propose to elevate Grand Avenue, the bridge over the Mill River, since that is a vital connection to the other parts of the city and will face increased flood risk over time. There's also the corridor along Clay Street, connecting to the FAME School. And so this idea of the FAME School as a potential site for a community resilience hub, and how are people traveling on foot, by bike from a resilience hub to the shoreline, and creating this idea of like a cooling corridor along Clay Street. That was part of the concept as well. Next slide. Okay, so that's a very quick summary of some of the work and some of the ideas that came out of the Resilient Fairhaven project. We did several of these over the last several years, and we took the lessons learned from that process and developed this Resilience Roadmap Recommendations Report. The link will be included in the slides. We can also drop the link into the chat so folks can read this. There's a series of 45 recommendations. We've organized them across 10 overarching themes or recommendations. And so, I don't think that we have time to go through all of them today, but, I think as part of our discussion, our panel discussion, I think we'll touch on many of these later in this program.
And you have about a minute or so left.
Okay. So I guess let's just leave it at this slide. But I guess I'll tee up the conversation. One of the overarching themes, I believe it's number 8, is for municipalities to develop and invest in new local funding sources. Grant funds, federal grant funds, state grant funds are going to be absolutely critical. But this idea of how municipalities can start to develop local funding sources is, one of the buckets, if you will, of the roadmap. And within that, there are things like stormwater authorities, developing this idea of a resilience improvement district. So I think that is going to be a critical need because, there's not going to be enough federal dollars to fix everything that we need to fix across the state and across the country. And we're competing with other places. And so we need to think about sustainable long-term local funding sources as a critical piece of that. So I think with that, I'll just pause it there. There's additional slides for each of the recommendations in the slide deck that you'll get as part of this. So, thanks for the time, and happy to have a discussion with the rest of the panelists.
Thanks, John. You've teed us up really well for a great continuation of the panel, and especially the panel discussion. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. To be able to do this level of resilience investment to meet some of the public policy objectives with helping communities and municipalities prepare for what used to be 100-year weather events, storm events, and now we're discovering are happening more and more frequently. You run out of local and philanthropic funds pretty quick, and that idea of partnership and leverage is one we'll come back to on the panel. But for the moment, we're going to turn things over to Lee Cruz, who is a resident of Fairhaven and a community champion of Fairhaven in his role with the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven. So over to you, Lee.
Thank you very much. Thank you for mentioning also that in addition to working at the foundation, I am a resident of Fairhaven, and something else that's relevant and it'll come up in a moment is that I'm also co-chair of the environmental I'm sorry, of the Equity and Environmental Justice Committee of the Governor's Task Force, the Governor's Council on Climate Change. I bring that up because I'm going to talk a little bit about community engagement, and we don't have nearly the time to cover the very thoughtful document that was put together and sits on the page with the recommendations from the governor. I think it was back at the end of 2023. There is an extensive paper there developed by many people on community engagement. I'm just going to touch on some highlights and talk a little bit about personal.
Lee, we lost your audio for a second here. Looks like you're back on mute.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, I accidentally touched the button. Very sensitive. So the community engagement that I want to talk to you about at the grassroots level is an engagement that is best, you can be most successful at, or is best done through personal experience. Now, not all of you are going to do this, but I'll give you some examples of very personal experience. For over 30 years, the Urban Resources Initiative has been working with New Haven neighborhoods around the city. And for 7 weeks in the summer, groups of us from neighborhoods and students from Yale who have been taught by the center put hand to shovel and literally put trees in the ground and plants. And the conversations that happen there, the understanding in both directions is pretty incredible. The Save the Sound effort around the bioswale park is another example. Save the Sound, in my years of experience with them, and these are shout outs. If there are any people from these organizations on the call, please take this out as a shout out to you. Save the Sound has come a long way in the time that I've known about them in terms of their connection. Again, boots on the ground and hands in the soil. And of course, there's the example of CIRCA, which is the one that we're going to be talking about the most. Diverse and inclusive communities require repeated, constant interaction, relationship building, and these things require resources that I'm going to talk about, and they also require that you get the resources to provide those resources, which I'm also going to talk about. So what resources are required? If you want to be really ready to go out into the community, you're committed to getting that information and sharing that information. Number one, you need translation. In this day and age, in New Haven at least, that's at least Spanish, bare minimum. Increasingly Arabic, but at least Spanish. You need to figure out where you're going to get the people that can do that simultaneous translation, which is ideal, with earphones, which is ideal. That technology has changed tremendously over the last few years. from requiring equipment that was thousands and thousands of dollars to literally a pocketbook size device that hangs from your shoulder, and you can literally be standing outside and taking people's ID or keys in exchange for an ear device. The speaker speaks into this device, and it's translated by a person. In the not too distant future, it'll be artificial intelligence doing that, but translation is essential. If you're going to have a meeting after regular work hours around 5, 6, 7, you must provide food. If you want families with children, people who are busy working 2 and 3 jobs, and I'm not talking about snacks or something you grabbed at Dunkin' Donuts. I'm talking about full meals that will allow a person to say, I don't have to go home and cook a meal and then think about leaving my house and where my kid's going to go. They can just come with their kids. And speaking of kids, childcare, providing childcare at meetings is also important. It doesn't have to be terribly sophisticated, but there has to be a dedicated space with a professional who knows what they're doing. Another thing, if possible, letting people know that you have funds for transportation. So whether that's passes for the bus or a voucher for some fuel, preferably the first one, passes for the bus when that's appropriate, when you're in that setting. And then the final and most difficult one for many people to understand and to justify is the possibility of paying a stipend for someone to attend and to participate. And I know this is not normal, but it is something that's happening more and more often, and is a good step, again, to get that inclusivity of the lower income population. So these are just some things that I think are resources that are required. We're going to talk about how to get at some of these things in a moment. So going specifically to the example of CIRCA and John, let me just start by saying that I met John, I don't know, when was it, John? Maybe 3, 4 years ago when he called me up. And the first thing he did is he took my advice and showed up in Fairhaven with his bicycle. And we literally biked around the entire peninsula for a couple of hours and looked at these various places that he had to that date only seen on maps. And now here he was standing at those locations with someone who had seen the place flood and go back, and the winds and the hurricanes, the whole 9 yards, because I have lived here on and off, more on than off, since 1983. So I've seen a tremendous amount of change. But it wasn't just the one-on-one conversation, it was repeated conversations. It was coming back to meet with the Fairhaven Community Management Team, which is a group of residents that meets monthly. It was connecting with the Chatham Square Neighborhood Association, another citizens group that's active between both of these organizations. We probably have 1,200 people on our mailing list who live in the area. Key also is the 501c3, that nonprofit organization that John mentioned, Junta for Progressive Action. They've been around since 1969, have tremendous credibility, are centrally located. This is how you start. But the question always comes, so that's great, where am I going to get the money to get this? Our city grant, our state grant, our federal grant does not allow for this, or has minimal money for this. So I would say to you that that community engagement that is equitable and inclusive requires that extra step, requires that extra funding, and the place to get it, whether they're ready to do it or not. If they're not ready, you need to help me to bring them to that space, including the foundation where I work. And that is the community foundations, also family foundations, but I know more about community foundations because I work in one. So community foundations have a good sense of the area where they serve, or they're not doing their job. And they work with local nonprofits. They can recommend potential partners. They can be sources of funding. In our particular case at the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, we have a particular program that I want to make sure you know about. It's called the Neighborhood Leadership Program. So for over 15 years, we have been identifying, supporting, and raising up others for others to see local grassroots leadership. I'm talking about leadership at the block level, leadership at the neighborhood level, and leadership of one or two neighborhoods. These people know about which they talk when it comes to their neighborhoods. They may or may not be served by the local nonprofits. They may be business owners. They may be a teacher. They may be a minister or some faithful member of a church, synagogue, or mosque, but they are connected. And finding those people is sometimes difficult when you're not a nearby person, but with help of community foundations, you should be able to identify those folks. When it comes to the community,
I'm just gonna do a 1-minute warning here.
Yep. So I am on my last few points here very quickly. So when it comes to the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven and the Valley Community Foundation, we have a small grants process, which has a fairly quick turnaround time for under $15,000. The Eastern Connecticut Foundation has an environmental fund that if you don't know about, you should definitely know about. Hartford, Fairfield County, and Connecticut Foundation, which serves the greater Waterbury area, are our counterparts in those parts of the state. When it comes to family foundations, there's the Graustein Memorial Fund. They're more interested in equity and inclusion. So the angle for them is from that angle toward the environment, where other foundations might have, that you probably know better, have more of an environmental focus. And what you need to do is educate them. Call me in if you want to help educate them about the importance of the inclusivity in the work. I'll close by telling you that if you want to see examples of this in action, this work, come visit me in New Haven. Let's arrange for a tour of Fairhaven neighborhood, and I'll show you how to connect a local place, history, environmental justice, climate change, and community. And I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Lee, and also for grounding today's discussion very much in the importance of local implementation in community context and need. Also really powerful to think about what it means to be, as we are interpreting, whether it's the Resilient Fairhaven report recommendations or the broader roadmap to resilience, how you think about doing these in equitable and inclusive ways, really starting from that grassroots level with local context. Great to champion some other foundations and resources like the Neighborhood Fund from the Community Foundation of Greater New Haven. I'll also just add one, Sustainable Connecticut's Community Match Fund can also be a great source for matching funds for grassroots level projects. But with that, we're going to switch to Stephen Winter. Stephen, if I can invite you to come back on camera and to think about how the city of New Haven, beyond Mayor Elliker's remarks, is really already in motion with implementing some of these great recommendations. Stephen, over to you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, as the mayor mentioned, there's literally hundreds of millions of dollars in funding for coastal resilience projects in New Haven, but a lot of that's been focused on the Long Wharf area, utilizing the I-95 berm essentially as a flood barrier and a stormwater tunnel system that will pump water out of downtown and the Union Station rail yard. So we know we have a lot more work to do beyond there. There are living shoreline projects in development for the Long Wharf and also for the East Shore area. And we're really thrilled to have the opportunity to work with CIRCA on the Resilient Fairhaven report, because we know that both in terms of climate risks and also social vulnerability, that Fairhaven's one of the most challenged parts of the city. And as Lee Cruz mentioned, it is a peninsula. And as John mentioned, it's really constricted, cut off from the city by the federal highway system and the East Coast Amtrak Railroad. So there are some challenges being a coastal community, having so much flood exposure as you saw on the map, and that will only increase in frequency and severity over time. There are challenges due to extreme heat. Fairhaven has more square footage of parking lots than of tree canopy, and so it's one of the most challenged parts of the city by extreme heat. And then there are concerns around how, in the event of a natural disaster, how people can reach points of refuge, or, as John mentioned, evacuate from the peninsula. So working with CIRCA was really revealing for me personally, my own understanding of how these larger concepts relate to the nitty gritty, looking at a block by block or intersection by intersection analysis of evacuation routes, and also looking at where the city can make investments in what the report called cooling corridors or resilience corridors, where we would look to expand tree canopy, also expand mobility options so that residents can more easily and more safely get to services and businesses, even in the event of extreme heat wave. And that's a concept that the city incorporated into its EPA community change application. So the EPA community change grant was this kind of like huge, could fund anything related to climate and environmental justice grant program that's still ongoing. And the city worked with many folks, Lee, and community development organizations, environmental nonprofits, citizens across the city, to try to draft a really community-driven application, and it ended up being very multifaceted. And one of the aspects we really focused on was this cooling corridor concept, and the way that ended up in the application is somewhat similar to what the city has done with bioswales, where we would divert stormwater from the stormwater system into a dry well where the water can percolate into the groundwater system. But instead of planting a small garden next to the water diversion, we would plant trees, and we would focus these areas in parts of the city where we still have combined sewer system and have stormwater challenges and flooding challenges, but also parts of the city like Fairhaven where there's a real need for investment in tree canopy. The tree planting program that Lee and the mayor mentioned is amazing. URI has done amazing work, and they were able to get support from U.S. Forest Service to expand that work over the next 5 years. One issue is that a lot of that model relies on adoption. So if there are areas where there's a shortage of folks willing to water a tree, you may not see the growth in tree canopy that you need to try to create a cool and resilient neighborhood. And so that's something we really focused on in that funding opportunity. I think one theme here that I would stress is like working with CIRCA has been incredibly beneficial for the city in terms of seeking federal funding. The City Plan Commission is working on Reconnecting Communities Planning Grant application through the USDOT. And I know that they're also incorporating aspects of the Resilient Fairhaven report into that proposal as they look to reconnect Fairhaven under and around the I-91 overpasses. So resilience,
with about a minute and a half warning.
Okay, great, minute and a half. So I think the city really thinks broadly about resiliency. I mentioned investments in tree canopy, the stormwater system, our famous bioswales. We're also thinking about social resilience. So in that community change proposal, included investments in green spaces and community gardens to help with kind of a green public spaces and social cohesion. And I think we remain really interested in the idea John mentioned of resilience hubs. So having physical and social infrastructure dedicated to resilience, whether that's a city facility or a local nonprofit. And then energy resilience, I think, is something else we're really interested in and have more work to do, whether that's microgrids or networked geothermal systems that can function in the event of a natural hazard event. So appreciate the time, and just excited about all the work and the much needed focus on these investments in Fairhaven.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And I think something that between your and the mayor's comments really hits home is just the level of kind of multifaceted benefit, or sometimes we call those co-benefits you get from resilience improvements, whether that is heat abatement, whether that is greenhouse gas mitigation, whether that is traffic calming, whether that is improved transit options for residents. So a lot to unpack there with where you guys are headed, and a lot also to think about in terms of supporting those types of investments in addition to funded resources, whether from local or state or federal sources. New Haven represents one of Connecticut's 169 municipalities. So now we're going to shift over and hear from Randy Collins with Connecticut's Conference of Municipalities on the results of their hotly anticipated flood study, on really thinking about how these types of impacts are not just being felt in New Haven, but across the state, whether it is for coastal or inland communities. So I'll hand things over to you, Randy.
Lee, thank you. I know we're anxious to kind of get to the panel discussion, so I will be brief in my comments. CCM just last week released a flood study report that we had been working on for about 2 years, and it was really spurred on by Mayor Bronin, who was our board president, getting a lot of calls at the time, garbage cans floating down the west end of Hartford. And so as CCM, as I said, we represent 167 of 169 towns and cities, and our board, our mayors and first selectmen. And they were looking and saying, well, what can we do about this? This is not just, the issue of flooding. We've looked a lot as a state at coastal flooding following Superstorm Sandy and some of those other events, but we're seeing it more riverine, pluvial flooding, and what we're doing about it, and how can we start to mitigate increasing rainfall, increasing intensity for our municipalities. So we contracted with Fuss & O'Neill and their partners with Dewberry and Resilient Land and Water, and spent about 2 years working on this study, looking at existing documentation, existing studies, reaching out to our municipal members, conducted a survey where we had almost 90 responses, which is over 50, almost 60% of what we had pushed out, and a number of stakeholder engagement meetings with CIRCA, Green Bank, state agencies. And we came up with about 30 recommendations. I won't go through all 30 of them. And these recommendations are kind of a combination of local options, best practices, areas where we're going to look for the state, our federal government to assist our municipalities, also looking for the state to help. But some of the main takeaways that we came back that we're really going to start to push is we really need to update our mapping throughout the state. It's really hard to do effective land planning, land use planning, looking at our zoning without up to date, making sure that those FEMA maps are up to date. Also, we need to incorporate, as I said, pluvial and stormwater flooding, which aren't included in the FEMA maps. That's an important aspect that we need to do. We have some recommendations in terms of the state building code regarding elevation requirements for new or substantially improved buildings. We're looking at climate resilient design standards. I know last year we had worked with OPM and the legislature to look at resiliency improvement districts and how can we make sure that when we build something, doesn't just meet the need of today, but can we anticipate, strengthening that infrastructure so that we don't have to replace or rebuild. We're also looking at the idea of that dam safety, given the major event that we had on October 18th or August 18th. As devastating as that was, there was some feedback from our members of like, well, if that had been near Norwich, with the dam in Bosra already, kind of at risk, what would have been the impact? And are we making sure that some of these dams that are on private property or state-owned, are we maintaining them? Are we identifying the ones that are truly at risk? Again, and we're also looking for, as I said, some land use best practices. The idea of local zoning is a very contentious issue on a lot of different fronts for our municipalities, and what works for one community doesn't necessarily work for another. So we're looking to push out best practices, and these could include riparian buffers, limiting development in river corridors and identified floodplains. We're also looking at how we can increase funding. Municipalities know that they're not going to, that they are going to have skin in this game, but municipalities are also very limited to the funding that they have locally. It's property tax driven. So to tap, in this economy, it's tough, and to tap residents to say, hey, I have to increase your property taxes again. It is a hard political decision. So are there opportunities outside of the property tax where we can get funding? And is it federal funding? Is it state funding? Or could it be the development of stormwater authorities, maybe at the regional level, not just local stormwater authorities, resiliency improvement districts, which I just mentioned, where you might have a vested community that's willing to fund some necessary improvement districts. And also we're really looking, how can we coordinate with our partners at the Green Bank, at DEEP, CIRCA, to make sure that we're coordinating local, regional, state efforts to mitigate flooding. We are not going to solve flooding. We'll always have flooding, but what can we do to make sure when it does occur that we're limiting the impacts of that, and that we're ready to go back to rebuild as we move forward. A lot of times we've seen areas where a community was replacing a culvert through a state grant, and that grant was about to expire, but they couldn't work right through DEEP, literally to connect the last 3 inches between that municipal culvert and a state dam. How do we make sure that when we're doing our projects, that the coordination is taking place, and that a town isn't putting in an 8-inch pipe and this, DOT is then putting in a 6-inch pipe, or vice versa, and creating inherent weaknesses in the system. So we're looking forward to working. We can put a link to this study. We'd hope, everyone to take a look at it and provide feedback. And we're going to be putting these recommendations into legislative proposals that we'll be working on with, as I said, with partners at the state, local level, and the federal level as we come forward to the next legislative session.
Thank you, Randy. And I think a lot for us to unpack there. We are a minute or two behind, and I'm up next, so I'll try and go real quick here. And Rudy, if you can help me get the slides back on. But really excited to see the flood study. The Connecticut Green Bank did participate in some of the engagement sessions, and are really thrilled, and look forward, Randy, to continuing to think through, how we can help to support the implementation pathways that are recommended there. So as told, I'm Lee Welkden, and Director of Environmental Infrastructure Programs here at the Connecticut Green Bank, where our mission is to confront climate change by increasing and accelerating investment into Connecticut's green economy to create more resilient, healthier, and equitable communities. So hopefully you see the through line there in our interest in the discussion today. The vision that guides all that we do is a planet protected by the love of humanity. And you can really feel the love for the community of New Haven and the Fairhaven neighborhood from my fellow panelists. It's a really important part of why we all do what we do. The Connecticut Green Bank, for folks who are less familiar, was established by the General Assembly in 2011 as the nation's first state-level green bank. We're a quasi-public state agency meant to accelerate the deployment of clean energy and now environmental infrastructure, using limited public dollars to attract private capital investment. Or another way to think about us, we use private sector disciplines to accomplish public sector objectives. Since inception, we've mobilized nearly $3 billion in the state's green economy at a 7-to-1 ratio of private to public funds. So a really key part of what we do is that leverage of private capital. And that has supported the creation of more than 27,000 green jobs and has reduced the energy cost burden on over 70,000 families, businesses, and nonprofits. But a lot of that has to do with energy impacts to date. And I'm really here to talk about more of the environmental infrastructure side. So why is that the case? In 2021, at the Green Bank's 10-year anniversary, Governor Lamont led a bipartisan effort to expand the Green Bank's model. That act, or Public Act 21115, expanded our authority from clean energy into environmental infrastructure, inclusive of climate adaptation and resilience, a lot of the types of things we've been talking about today. We are just getting started, but our initial strategy is a 3-pronged concept of how to support our efforts. Number 1, expanding existing Green Bank programs to include aspects of environmental infrastructure. These are things that we can do relatively quickly using a lot of the bench strength of the Green Bank and our capacity of our colleagues. Number 2 is to pursue opportunistic project finance opportunities. So if you're aware of a project, I'll have more on that, but please let us know. And longer term, to really think about opportunities for developing strategic programs, which I'll get into in a moment. Next slide. So related to number 1, expanding existing programs, this spring, we were thrilled to begin expanding one of our flagship Green Bank offerings to include climate resilience and water measures. That is our Smart E residential home improvement lending program. This program provides unsecured loans for home energy improvements and now resilience improvements up to $50,000 and for flexible terms out to 20 years. To date, we've only had 2 loans approved so far for the new measures, but please help us get the word out, especially as we think about empowering residents across the state to be making some of these necessary resilience improvements and investments at their literal backyard, not even their backyard, their actual home. Next slide. And earlier this summer, we also expanded our Capital Solutions open request for proposals. For potential projects that don't fit within other Green Bank product offerings, Capital Solutions allows for more tailored financial solutions based on unique needs and project opportunities. We're actively soliciting interest, so please let us know if you have a potential initiative that may be appropriate for project financing. And next slide. And I also mentioned that 3rd prong, thinking about longer, more strategic program development. And this is what really hits home for us when we think about the topic of resilience improvement districts that have come up a few times on the panel today. As part of that exploration into where the Green Bank can really be designing financing programs to support implementation of resilience needs, resilience improvement districts were a really high priority for us. So we supported the development of that concept in last year's Governor's Resilience Bill. And we're not sure what form the bill might take yet in the 2025 legislative session, but certainly hope that those on the call and listening in at home might consider lending their support or otherwise envisioning how to get involved in advancing the state's capacity to advance resilience improvement through resilience improvement districts. These are areas voluntarily designated by municipal leadership as vulnerable to climate-driven issues, like everything we're talking about today in terms of storm surges and flooding, both near and coming down the pipe. A RID designation would enable the municipality to implement effectively a tax increment financing structure to fund green infrastructure and other resilience projects or nature-based solutions within that district to increase climate resilience. And perhaps a little bit aspirational still, but in an ideal world, property owners within that district would be eligible for lower insurance premiums as the resilience improvement lowers the risk of climate-related impacts. So lots more to say here, but I'll pause myself in the interest of time and will invite my fellow panelists to join me back for our discussion. And as we get going with the discussion, I have just a couple of kind of rapid fire panel questions to seed the conversation. This is also a reminder to all of you who've stuck with us that we're game for your questions. You've just got to answer them in the chat. So please let us know if you have some questions and we'll try to get to those. Okay, great. I've got all my panelists back. So Lee, if I could start with a quick question with you. We talked a lot about grounding and local need. Anything else that you really hope people keep in heart and in mind when we think about the process by which resilient improvement districts, or not districts, resilient improvements writ large, get enacted in a way that respects and empowers the community in a place like Fairhaven? Often, you think about the types of improvements that could inadvertently potentially spur displacement of residents. So just want to ground the conversation again in some of your local context and experience. How do we make sure that we're not gentrifying the communities that we're hoping to strengthen?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. So I think what's key is to invest the time in identifying local leadership, not just political leadership, check off the box, we talk to the alder or the city council member, but to really get into the community through them if they're well connected, and through other means, through churches, synagogues, mosques, through sometimes schools, teachers. So I think that that's key to understanding the broader picture. Oftentimes these days, agencies, organizations do turn to established nonprofits, sometimes to religious organizations. Remember that they serve a segment of the population. They don't serve the entire population. Look towards small business associations as well. We have an active one in the Grand Avenue Special Services District. So ideally, find the person or people that can give you a list of people that then you can consider depending on your project. Help those of us who live locally to identify good partners. With the help of the city, we were able to identify an excellent partner to work with us on the redevelopment of the old Strong School into affordable housing with a focus on the LGBTQ community. This building is just one short block away from the Quinnipiac River, and these are folks that are really going to be taking that into account in the planning for that building. So again, the guidance would be to talk, spend a lot of time talking at the front end. I did send you, Lee, the link to the public engagement documents from the Governor's Council on Climate Change. I hope you get a chance to share those with folks. Thanks.
Thank you, Lee. And I'll turn to you, Randy, potentially moving a little inland in our consideration. So we know the governor's bill failed to gain enough support in the last legislative session. And as we were unpacking what happened, we heard that one potential issue could have been resilience improvement districts being considered more of a coastal community issue, and that there was less support from inland communities. And though coastal communities do face certain climate-related risks that may be slightly different or greater, especially coastal flooding. One thing that was really interesting in the CCM flood impact study was that riverine flooding impacted over 70% of those municipalities surveyed. So how do we think about garnering more support in the coming legislative session for these issues, including helping inland communities understand their own stake in increased resilience?
I mean, I think our members are very aware of it. And I just think turning on the news, we're seeing that flooding is not just a coastal issue. And in support for resiliency improvement districts, that was something that CCM was supportive of, worked with a number of different advocates on behalf of that, because one of the aspects I think our membership really liked was it's a local option. If it worked for their community, it's something that they could do, but it's not something that might be right for every community. And I think that that's one of the key aspects as we look at these, is there's not a one size fits all solution. And the idea is, what tools can we provide to our towns, our cities, that will work for them? But you're right. I mean, we've seen, again, I'll look at our Stratford has experienced coastal flooding, riverine flooding, and stormwater flooding. They've experienced all types. And then you have a community like Thomaston, the idea of coastal flooding that doesn't impact them whatsoever. So flooding is an issue, but how do we, collectively say, we need to address this. We need to provide the tools, technical assistance, financial assistance. And if it's a resiliency district or if it's a stormwater authority, how can we help educate, those towns, educate their members, their population, of why these ideas are important and what they're going to accomplish. So I think, outreach through groups like Lee's and those community groups to work with the community and explain this is what this is going to do and this is why we need to move forward with it is important.
Absolutely. And I'll pivot to a question that's more for the panelists in the round. So a lot of what has kind of underpinned some of the recommendations being made today is a little bit of cost benefit analysis, or some of the theory that, if we make these improvements and investments today, we will be better off in the future, both in terms of, most importantly, human well-being, but also importantly in terms of the cost of recovery, the cost of damages, and hopefully avoiding those costs. There's a new climate resilience report from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in partnership with Allstate. It's called the Preparedness Payoff. And they actually found that investing in resilience saves jobs and incomes, estimating that every dollar spent on climate resilience yields about $13 in economic savings and damages and cleanup costs avoided. So obviously it can be really tough to sell people on saving money from risks that they avoid. The impact of something that never happened. And we need to continue to be building inroads with the insurance sector as partners and allies in this journey. But in terms of the millions of everyday decisions that people across the state make, how can we really think about making this argument on the return on investment for resilience and getting to scaled outcomes from government, businesses, and households? How do we get people to make those upfront investments today in better resilience tomorrow? So I'll plant that seed and can pick up on a couple of themes there. And if you're shy, I'm going to cold call.
Okay, I'll jump in on the insurance side, because the other half of the CCM house is CIRCA, which is the Connecticut Interlocal Risk Management Agency. It's municipal insurance, statutorily created, and the number one recommendation that they looked at out of this report was the mapping. And say we need the updated mapping because it will drive planning, and by knowing where the risks are, it's going to reduce. If I know that I'm in a floodplain that maybe wasn't there in a map 20 years ago, I'm not going to put infrastructure there, or I'm going to harden what I have there. And again, it's going to reduce your insurance liabilities. It's going to reduce your rebuilding costs. So, no one wants to pay. I don't want to pay for car insurance, but I'm sure glad I have it when I need it. And I think there's a lot of people out there that don't know that they need it because, as I said, 20 years ago, maybe you didn't need it, but because of economic development, environmental changes, you need it now. So I think it's driving that, and it's that part of the education that yes, you don't want to have to pay for insurance, but you're sure happy when you have it. And that long-term risk of, well, your premiums will go down with a reduced risk. So there is savings down the road.
And John, that picks up on a really key theme and recommendation from the Roadmap to Resilience report, which has a lot to do with things that are built where they oughtn't to have been and building new things where they oughtn't to be, let's say. How do you think about some of these issues in terms of avoiding future costs?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's well, it's not a simple black and white thing, and I think, I think part of what the idea of a resilience improvement district or a resilience overlay zone or whatever these kind of like tools are, is to develop a master plan for an area of the community that brings together the issues of housing, transportation, with and it gives the municipality a chance to be proactive with the setting the standards. I heard design standards. I know that's something in the CCM report, and I think that's critical, is allowing the municipality to sort of set the expectations rather than having developers. Developers might have a shared interest, but it may not be exactly the same interest. In some cases, developers might develop a property in a place that has high value, and they might sell those assets off, and then the municipality and the building owners are left with the residual risk over time. So it's important that the municipalities are proactive about saying, this is what our standards are going to be for development in this area, and that has to be informed by high resolution risk maps that are forward looking. And I think, that's really critical, because the last thing we want to do is create more problems, either, creating more stormwater problems, more heat problems, flood risk that is going to require grant funding to fix later on. So the first rule is that we don't want to make the problem worse. And so, it's a tricky thing, and we have to kind of balance redevelopment with flood risk management, and it's not simple. So,
Lee, over to you.
Yeah, I just want to throw in a quick pitch for on this issue of maps. Bring maps to public meetings. Bring big maps that you can lay down on tables. Bring markers and pencils and pens. Think about what you need to have on the map. You don't want to bring the engineering map. You want to bring the simplest map you can for that purpose, and let people draw on those maps. Circles and arrows. Some of you may be old enough to remember the song Alice's Restaurant talks about circles and arrows, and a paragraph on the back of each picture explaining what the circles and arrows mean. That's what you want to do. And you want to collect those up, because it's incredible the knowledge that's out there that people have about what's where, how it gets used, how often by their community, trends, changes of where people go fishing, where you might want to, take something into account, or the other thing. So I would say maps are really important, and they help cross the language and cultural divide in a way that a written document cannot.
Thanks, Lee. And just a quick time check. We've gotten 2 questions as far as I can tell from chatting with Rudy. I think we'll try and handle those in follow-up after the webinar, since we're short on time today. I'll just try and tie us off with a quick, as we look 10, 20 years into the future, we will be successful if. And I will take the risk of responding to that first, buying you each a quick second to think about a very short response. I think 10 to 20 years from now, we will be successful if Connecticut municipalities have been fully empowered to really find multiple and layered solutions to the various aspects of resilience they need, and to the various forms of capital to help get them there. Stephen, I'll punt to you next.
It says what success looks like in 10 to 20 years.
Wave your magic wand.
Well, yeah, I think like you said, combining local, state, federal funding sources, green bank financing, pulling resources together to make investments in our coasts, in our tree canopies, in community nodes for resiliency, those hubs that John mentioned. I think those are going to be really critical, both the physical infrastructure and also the social infrastructure required for resiliency. And like you were saying, framing it in a way that underscores the need. So connecting this to the major storm events we've had, the flooding events that we've seen recently. Nobody questions the value of fire hydrants and fire departments. We need to group these in the same category.
Great, Stephen. And for the remaining panelists, one thing that will help us get there. John, I'll point to you.
One thing will be the state can build on the work of groups like CIRCA and the Green Bank to create an integrated program to get people to work together. That includes the nonprofits and the academic institutions to help the communities. We need to break down the silos and work together to be successful.
Love it. Spoken as if you run the state agency's Fostering Resilience Working Group. Randy, over to you.
Just a continued robust partnership between our local, state, and federal governments to make sure that when funding is available, that the planning is in place, and then that funding is easily accessible to communities with different resources, be it urban, rural, suburban, because they all have different needs, different capacities, but that's where you need that partnership across all levels of government.
Yep, and grounding it once again in local context, how we started this session. Lee, over to you. One thing that'll help us get there.
Well, you know what? I'm going to just break the rule here, and I like your first question better, so I'm going to answer the first question, because I have a 10-year-old and I have a 13-year-old, and in 20 years, I want them and other kids in Connecticut to be in the town or near the town where they grew up saying, I remember when I attended a meeting where we talked about, my parents were talking about something that needed to change, and here it is. Here's the infrastructure change that's making it better or making it possible for us to continue to have a healthy life and a good economic, productive life, because the adults at that time made those decisions, made those difficult decisions, and started implementing them. And now it's our turn to pass that forward to the next generation. That's what I want to see in 20 years.
That's the perfect place to tie this off. So please join me in thanking our panelists. It's been really excellent to kick off this inaugural Connecticut Sustainability and Resilience Week, focusing on municipal resilience issues and grounding that in local context in Fairhaven and New Haven. I know we didn't have much time for questions. For the couple that trickled through, we'll follow up directly after this session to continue the conversation. Really want to thank everyone for joining and sticking with us today. We will send the recording and slides through this week, so stay tuned for that. And again, please enjoy the rest of Connecticut Sustainability and Resilience Week, and thank you once again to the panel for helping us be a part of it. Cheers, folks. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.